panel, even though I know who these people are, right? I've read their work, I selected the work, along with, by the way, I should say, I have forgotten to mention this, and for this I apologize, but Dr. Mei Chan, who was for a very long time a professor tenured at the College of St. Rose in Albany, which closed in May of 2024, was shut down for a variety of reasons, fiscal and otherwise. Ooh.
Neilson Library will be closing in 30 minutes.
Not us, though.
Prepare to exit the building.
Okay. She worked with Meridians last year from July of 2024 to July of 2025 as an editorial assistant, right? PhD in English, you know, tenured, has written books and so forth. But she happens to live here in Northampton, the Florence section of Northampton, and use that opportunity to kind of rethink next steps. And it happened that I was looking for an editorial assistant, someone part-time, as we transitioned hopefully into the possibility of hiring someone full-time. And so she applied and she graced us with her intellect and her knowledge. And she participated in making some decisions and suggesting some of the panelists, including specifically this panel, the literary studies panel, because that is in fact her field. She's a scholar of English women's colonial writing about China in the pre-World War II period. So I just want to thank Dr. Mei Chan in absentia for her contributions to this celebration, but also to this panel specifically. And to signal for you, so in case you start feeling tired and think of slipping out, that we are having a dinner after this. It's a little more relaxed, a little smaller and low key, but we have ordered some nice catering food. Also back at the campus center, this time on the first floor in one of the fishbowl rooms, those glass walled rooms, 103, 104. And we do invite you to join us after this last panel for some more informal conversation and as a way to kind of say goodbye and stay strong together, okay? So on that note, I really have the tremendous, tremendous pleasure of introducing you to this final, but as I said, in no way, less panel of the day. Our moderator for this panel is Professor Heidi Kim, who is also a member of the Meridians Editorial Advisory Board for the Duke UNC Research Triangle. Professor Kim's research and teaching ranges through the 19th to 21st century American literature, with specializations in the Japanese American incarceration of World War II, law and literature, and the Cold War period. At the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, she directed the Asian American Center, founded in 2020, and created the AAC Asian American Center Fellows Program. She has also published on Walt Whitman and anti-slavery literature, including the partial translation of Louisiana Francophone novel Le Vieux Salomon, and collaborated on interdisciplinary environmental research. Currently, she is writing Asian American literature, a very short introduction, for Oxford University Press. She can also be seen in the new documentary about William Faulkner, The Past is Never Dead. Please welcome Professor Heidi Kim. Professor Deepti Misri is an associate professor in the Department of Women and Gender Studies at the University of Colorado Boulder. She is the co-editor of the Routledge Handbook of Critical Kashmir Studies, published in 2022, and author of Beyond Partition, Gender, Violence, and Representation in Post-Colonial India, published in 2014. She is also a founding member of the Critical Kashmir Studies Collective, a feminist scholarly collective whose work focuses on Indian militarized occupation in Kashmir. Please welcome Professor Misri. Professor Ayesha K. Hardison is the Susan D. Gubar Chair and Associate Professor of English at Indiana University at Bloomington. She is the author of Writing Through Jane Crow and a co-edited book that she has and a co-edited book. She has published several book chapters as well as articles in the African American Review and Meridians. She is director of the History of Black Writing, a literary recovery and preservation project and archive, as well as co-editor of the multidisciplinary journal, Women, Gender, and Families of Color. Please welcome Professor Hardison. Professor Nancy Kang is Canada Research Chair in Transnational Feminisms and Gender-Based Violence, an Associate Professor of Women and Gender Studies, and the Acting Director of the University of Manitoba Center for Creative Writing and Oral Culture. She co-authored The Once and Future Moose, The Poetry and Poetics of Rhina Espaillat, published by University of Pittsburgh Press in 2018. Kang's most recent peer-reviewed scholarship appears in American Literature, ESC, English Studies in Canada, and Meridians, Feminism, Race, Transnationalism. She is also a member of the Creative Writing Advisory Board and the first winner of the Elizabeth Alexander Creative Writing Award for Poetry. And last but not least, Professor Min Young Godley. Excuse me. Min Young Godley is a lecturer at Dartmouth College in the Writing Program and Master of Arts in Liberal Studies. Her research interests include American and transnational literature, critical race theory, and gender studies. She received her PhD from the University at Buffalo as a Fulbright Scholar and has published The Feminization of Translation, Gender Politics and the Translation Controversy over Han Kang's The Vegetarian in Meridians, Feminism, Race, Transnationalism. Welcome, Professor Godley.
Good afternoon, everyone. I want to start by echoing all of the thanks that people have been expressing throughout the day to Janetta and the staff and the student interns of Meridians for your professionalism, your spirit, your warm hospitality. I'm also really delighted to see what a great home Meridians has at Smith, how much support there is from alumni, from the leadership, from the faculty. Meridians richly deserves it, but you know, in this world, things don't always get what they deserve. So I've been really delighted to see it, and it's my first visit to Smith, and I'm taking away such a wonderful impression of the community here. It's my privilege to be chairing this literary studies panel. Particularly important because Janetta's been raising the roof for sociology all weekend, and I would just like to say other majors are available. In all seriousness, I think when the editorial advisory board was brainstorming topics for these panels, literary studies is such a rich vein for Meridians, and put very simply, literature is where resistance can be imagined when there are very little resources, and it's also where we dream better. So it's important, and it always will be. Today, what I'm going to do, because this is actually the only panel that is framed really around a field or a genre, what I thought I'd do is, you know, each panelist will get one question very specific to their article so that you can get a sense of the richness of the work in Meridians, and then we'll have some questions kind of opening up to think about literary studies and the principles of Meridians. So all of these articles, these were published, by the way, from 2011 to 2021, which is not a very long expansive time, but think about who was president in each of those years in the US and who came in between. It's quite a long expansive time after all. These articles are calling not just for different feminist hermeneutics, but new archives and narratives taking us around the globe and considering very different contemporary texts. So I'll start with Deepti. Your article, which is grounded in a reading of Shauna Singh Baldwin's novel about the partition of India and Pakistan in 1947, offers a richly multi-layered analysis of the symbolism of women's bodies particularly as testimonies of violence, as well as a feminist hermeneutics of doubt and historical reading. How can a feminist historiography transform our understanding of partition, as well as our understanding of the gendered nature of traditional nationalist histories?
Thank you, Heidi. Can you hear me? Is this working? Is this also working? This one. Closer. Okay, better?
Really close.
But I just want to know, does this work? I just had to figure that out. Like, I thought it wasn't, but just making sure. Okay, so I'll try to sort of lean close. I want to say thank you all for sticking in here for the last panel of this absolutely delightful day. I can easily say this is one of the most enlivening conferences I've been to in a long, long time. And it's just remarkable. And, you know, I know that at least some of you might have had this thought too. The next time we teach transnational feminism, this is the syllabus. It's just a ready-made syllabus for us to draw on. I've just been so delighted to learn of the work that all of you are doing and just kind of refamiliarize myself with with some work that I was familiar with already from before. And Heidi, your invitation to think about this long span is so interesting. This article, the one that you're talking about, was published in 2011. It was also one of my first publications, not my very first, but probably my second. So it is actually quite interesting to see that there are so many people here who've had that experience. And it was a delightful one. I really very much enjoyed the process. And, that article went on to become, the segment of a chapter from my first book, which is called Beyond Partition. That title also kind of encompasses maybe the years between the publication of the article and what I'm interested in now. So I'm going to take your invitation to speak about the article, but also, how I'm kind of revisiting some of the things that came up in the article. And, just in terms of thinking of that sweep between 2011 and now, in the sort of corner of the world that I work in, the big event, which is sort of, India, and, I'm sort of, my contemporary work is all about Kashmir and India's sort of colonization of Kashmir or forced occupation of that region. The big thing that actually in the subcontinent that has happened is that Narendra Modi, Prime Minister Narendra Modi, kind of came into power in 2014. And the Hindu nationalist government has been sort of in power ever since. And so a lot of what we're seeing right now in the United States, all of these sort of chilling crackdowns and sort of surveillance and monitoring of social media, it's all been tested in other places. I mean, in some ways, Modi has led the charge in India for a lot of this. And so, that has also kind of shaped the direction of my interests, kind of both methodologically, politically, and so on. So to speak about the article itself, both the novel that I wrote about was the Sikh Canadian writer Shauna Singh Baldwin's novel, What the Body Remembers. And both that novel and the article that I wrote were deeply informed, to your question, by a feminist historiography of partition, particularly two books of oral history that were published in 1998 by Urvashi Butalia, this book called The Other Side of Silence, and then Ritu Menon and Kamla Bhasin also published in the same year another book called Borders and Boundaries that became really foundational to the field of partition feminist historiography and kind of inaugurated it. These were powerful oral histories that really centered the experiences of women during the partition of India, which was a time of sort of cataclysmic violence. The sort of like, the line of partition dividing India from Pakistan was drawn really swiftly. There was sort of violence broke out between Hindu, Muslim, and Sikh communities, in just many different regions where the sort of line was being drawn. And it was, of course, like a, dramatically violent moment. So one of the first things that this historiography did is it kind of transformed our understanding of partition as something that had happened between states, right? India and Pakistan, for example, born in that sort of moment of when the moment of independence was simultaneously with the sort of moment of partition, right? So it was called like the birth pangs of like these South Asian nation states. But these feminist historiographers kind of came along and said that, rather than thinking of this as something that has happened between states, we need to think about this as something that has happened to people on a massive scale. Over 12 million people were displaced in this moment. About 75,000 women were abducted and raped. There was just massive upheaval. Like cities like Delhi, for example, changed radically because of the influx of new populations, massive creation of sort of refugee populations and so on and so forth, right? So that was partly what they were doing, was calling attention to the human cost of partition, which meant decentering the sort of magisterial state-centered histories and rendering a view of history from below, which then creates space for creating, centering experiences of the marginalized. At least we're not getting evacuated, which is what I first thought. Okay. All right. So centering the experiences of the marginalized women, poor people, children, people from subordinated castes. These were the experiences that these feminist historiographers were seeking to capture. They also looked, of course, at the symbolic forms of violence that had erupted against women and men and men, by the way, during this moment. And very often, the sort of sexual violence against men is not talked about as such. It's rendered as just violence. But what we're talking about is sort of, like many, many instances of sort of genital violence against men that typically have not been talked about in that frame. But they were interested in talking about these symbolic forms of violence where women's bodies and men's bodies were literally inscribed with religious symbols of the other community, right? And so, so for example, in violence committed by Hindu mobs, like it was women's bodies would be sort of marked with symbols like Om or like the Trishul or like these symbols that are sort of associated with Hinduism, right? And yet, what these researchers found was that within families and communities, there was a silence surrounding these women and what had happened to them, right? Especially if they'd been raped, that was something that was kind of not openly addressed and so on. Now, in the novel that I wrote about, I took up a scene that I noticed was, this was a novel that was deeply inspired by these feminist historiographers, by the way, these oral historians who had done this work. So this novelist was sort of had taken the scene, I noticed from one of these books, Urvashi Bhutalia's The Other Side of Silence, and I was interested in the kind of literary transmutation of one of the testimonies that appeared in that book in particular. And that is a scene, a testimony, a real testimony, where a man recounts killing his own daughter in order to save her honor. And this is something that happened, very frequently within families in partition. The mentality being that, it's better that as your kinsman, I just kill you off in order to protect you from being raped later on by the other community, right? So these kinds of testimonies were being gathered by these feminist historiographers. And in this novel, I explored the literary strategies through which the author kind of transmutes that scene into a sort of literary scene, where she sort of encodes a hermeneutics of doubt in the telling of such stories by men after the fact, right? So after the fact, once that kind of killing of one's own women has sort of happened, then it is kind of narrated in this kind of tragic register. The women folk are narrated as having been killed to preserve their honor. They're narrated as having gone to their deaths willingly, etc. So, the reading that the literary sort of critical reading was just kind of looking at how she layers perspectives around this dismembered body of this woman who is both, first, as it later transpires, we find out that the first cut came from her father-in-law in order to save her honor. And then later, she was discovered by a mob that then disemboweled her, because she was pregnant. I'm sorry, this is very violent, and dismembered the body, right? But what's interesting is when the reader first encounters the body in the text, it's not clear which came first, right? And so you see sort of different perspectives being narrated where, one person says, oh, when I discovered, one person just sees the body and assumes that it's been dismembered by the mob, and only later we find out that she had actually been killed by her own father-in-law, right? So the aim of that was, of course, to reveal the violence within the family and within the community and nation, which was often obscured while the violence from without was overemphasized, right? So the sexual threat and the violence is coming from outside. And these feminist historiographers, I think the signal contribution was to point to the violence within the family that broke out during this time, right? And to count it as such. And so what that scene does, the way you encounter the body, points to a continuum of violence against women within and without the family, right? So for these feminist historiographers, like they were looking back, I mean, almost, like 50 years after the partition or about 50 years after the partition, and sort of pointing to this kind of continuum of violence. That was a big framework. Now, this remains an imperative today, in my view. So the interesting thing is, in my recent work is concerned with Kashmir, which is, today notorious as the most heavily militarized zone in the world. And occupied by the Indian state, which operates as a colonial power in the region. So in the 1990s, as the movement for self-determination took an armed turn, some of you may know this history, this sort of very small population of Kashmiri Hindus, which was not the only population that was displaced, but the larger part of that community left Kashmir en masse because of a sort of a dynamic whereby they internalized fear. There was a particular narrative of what was happening in the public sphere that's actually also a historiographic question, and we can talk about that later. But in this moment of displacement where this Hindu community that had allied with India, felt sort of an all-encompassing threat around them when they heard the slogans for independence from India, some of which took on a religious idiom for all sorts of historical reasons. In that moment, too, you saw a similar thing happening. Women being told, Kashmiri Hindu women being told by their own families, take this poison pill, keep it in your pocket in case it's needed, just swallow this. And this is actually not very much talked about. But again, in that story too, and this is, from the 1990s, by the way, 1989, 1990, the dominant narrative remains that the threat was from outside, right? Not from the Hindu father who slept with a gun so that he could kill his daughters if militants who were Muslim came by, but the threat is from outside. Right? So again, this remains, I think, a really sort of pertinent framework. Now, of course, when it comes to the symbolism of Muslim women's bodies in South Asia and in so many other places, we also need to be attentive to projections from state and dominant communities, right? In the case of India, that would be a Hindu community. Muslim women being, and this will be very familiar to you, being figured as victims of Muslim patriarchy, but never of the occupying state, right? So a hermeneutics of doubt remains important in getting us to look aslant at both state and dominant community narratives. Now, looking, from the standpoint of my work today in Kashmir, it is actually quite interesting to have this opportunity to go back and look at some of this feminist historiography, because it really reveals how some of the feminist frameworks developed to understand that history of the partition don't really work in the context of understanding an ongoing present of colonial occupation by a massively militarized state. And so I'm going to quote for you an analysis from one of these very historians, very sort of prominent historians from whom I've learned a lot, Urvashi Butalia, writing about Kashmir. And so she writes in 2002 in a volume called Speaking Peace, her analysis of this is that all sides in the battle use violence, and that Kashmiri women I'm quoting, face the combined wrath of the patriarchal practices of all men surrounding them, whether militants or security forces or their own families or indeed the state. And, again, there is that continuum of violence framework that made a lot of sense in the context of partition historiography that absolutely fails in the context where there's a false equivalency being drawn between a handful of militants and a massively militarized state. And so Kashmiri feminists, in reading Urvashi Butalia's work, have really sort of, pushed back against this particular kind of narrative. It has been sort of fiercely contested by Kashmiri feminists. So that's also a reminder to us that as fruitful and productive as partition feminist historiography has been in kind of restoring violence within the family to view, in decentering state-centered narratives, which is also very important to us in critical Kashmir studies, like a field that we have collaboratively developed to register the Indian occupation of Kashmir as an occupation, as important as that generation of partition historiographers' work has been on the one hand, it also kind of meets its limit if we try to take that competing patriarchies framework and just plaster it onto the context of an ongoing occupation. So I'll end there, and yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Deepti. Turn to the other end of the table. Ayesha, where author and auteur meet, which is such a great title, asks us to consider the performance of Black female subjectivity in Martha Southgate's novel Third Girl from the Left. Specifically, you argue for a recognition of Black women's artistic and erotic expression as a counter for historical silencing. But you also suggest that we are being warned by Southgate against looking for a historical truth. Your article is so richly, you'll have to wait and find out.
Library will be closing in 5 minutes. Please visit the central service point if you have any questions.
As I was saying, your article is so richly contextualized with political and popular depictions of Black men and women. What are the new roles and artistic paths for Black women that Southgate succeeds in freeing for her readers to fill in the empty signs, as you so eloquently put it?
Thank you for that question, and thank you for your positive and very complimentary reading of the essay as well. I appreciate that. The question really showed your appreciation for the article, which I appreciate in turn. Before answering the question, I also want to articulate my gratitude for being invited here. This was an interesting opportunity to look back on earlier work. And as I reread or reviewed my article in anticipation of this conversation, it occurs to me that this article wasn't my first peer-reviewed publication, but it was my second, and more importantly, it was critical for my tenure package. So that's what came back to me as I looked at this article, and also to realize that I was probably writing for my professional life in that essay. You spoke about how contextualized it was, and when I was reading through it, like how much work I was doing in that essay. And so putting that in the context of tenure, in the context of where I am now professionally, it has been an interesting experience. I also want to acknowledge, looking back at the article, it's a nostalgic moment of mentorship for me. It was actually one of my graduate advisors, Arlene Kaiser, who told me to send the article to Meridians. So I want to acknowledge her as to how I got introduced to the journal, but also to say that it's been a wonderful experience to be a part of celebrating institution building, which is really important, but also to be claimed by that as well. So I'm very appreciative and grateful for that. In relationship to your question about the essay, just briefly, I'll describe what I'm examining in the essay, which is really about an erotic or trying to inhabit and perform an erotics that is both sexual and artistic, or based in both sexual and artistic desire. Southgate's novel explores 3 generations of women, and in that each woman is negotiating her sexuality as well as her relationship to film. So we have a grandmother who is a movie watcher or a movie goer, but is sexually repressed in various ways. And in this matrilineal generational kind of story, there are also, the women are situated in specific historical moments. So the grandmother has experienced a trauma due to the Tulsa riots. Her daughter is an aspiring actress, and in some ways she's sexually repressed, in other ways she's hypersexualized, and her political moment is Black power. So she's really trying to negotiate the complicated politics of Blaxploitation. And then the daughter is trying to negotiate these histories or these legacies without knowing very much about them. And ultimately, she is in a post-civil rights hip hop political moment. She aspires to be a filmmaker. And what we see is that she idealizes Spike Lee. But in order to kind of complete a documentary and maybe actualize a kind of empowered artistic integrity, she has to reconnect with the stories of her mother and her grandmother. And so in thinking about what Southgate offers us in terms of freeing her characters or more freeing pathways, particularly in regard to African-American women in popular culture, or more specifically film, I think she offers us 2, which I appreciate your question too, because I tend to focus on what are the problems and how complicated they are. But to ask a question about what's freeing or liberating is definitely important and kind of pushes me in other ways as well, as I think back on this essay. And I think the two ways that Southgate offers pathways for her characters, but also people reading the novel or Black women more broadly or women of color more broadly, is one, an old way, which is being a reader or being a consumer of popular culture.
Neilson Library is now closed. Please exit the building or move to the 24-hour space in Alumni Gym.
After that important announcement, I see Southgate arguing for the importance of a recognition. So even as, you know, characters are unable to control their narratives in various ways, they do experience a kind of pleasure in culture, and that should be recognized, but also their various artistic endeavors, which could be rigidly defined in a binary of success or failure, being defined as failure, but that there is some value to that. And I think she's making an argument about our consumption, but also validating what we've seen Black feminist theorists highlight as contrary instincts, for example, that we're negotiating those things, or oppositional gazes. And so I see her kind of advocating for the way in which we consume things, and that we have to negotiate them and engage them or observe them critically. But the new path that I think Southgate offers is about cultural production and being artists and inhabiting that, and what that may look like. And not that that resolves all the issues that Black women are encountering. Some things are not resolved, definitely not by the end of the novel. But I think she articulates and validates a version of truth, not a truth capital T, or not a particular kind of history, but one that's interpreted and one that's created, and that has power as well.
Great. Thank you, Ayesha. Nancy, your reformulation of the pre-colonial Dominican myth and archetype of the Ciguapa, a naked and beautiful woman with backward feet, works through the poems of Rhina Espaillat, of course, someone you've worked on a great deal, to consider the relationship between female endurance and environmental loss. Particularly striking to me is the richness of the metaphors that you untangle in the way that the Ciguapa can highlight those who are considered backward by society, indigenous histories and ways of being, and a care for the wilderness as sustaining rather than viewing it as civilizable. How can we recenter both our modes of reading and, as you suggest, mourning, to inspire or to focus on different voices in art and activism?
Thank you so much, Heidi, for your eloquent question. I also wanted to reiterate my thanks to my fellow panelists. Ayesha and I actually met in 2012 at a NEH seminar on contemporary African-American literature. So it's a wonderful homecoming. And I'd also like to thank Janetta, the incomparable Janetta, and the superlative team of everyone who made this happen. So it's a real pleasure and honor for me to be here. To answer Heidi's question, I wanted to actually start because Rhina Espaillat is a poet. She was born in 1932. She's an elder, but she's one of the youngest people you will ever meet. And there was a movement to have her be the inauguration poet for President Biden. That didn't work, but certainly the momentum was there. So I'm going to start with a short excerpt from one of her poems, Time Travel. So yes, time travel. There's no way back the way we came. Looking back now, the way we came led us astray. Signposts that we failed to spot as daylight failed. The ways we came, or is it we, are not the same. So part of the power of this, and we even saw it with these interruptions, like the confluence of interruption and flow, right? So as Heidi intoned in her question, the Ciguapa is a Dominican myth. right? Native to the island, it is definitely a figure that has been taken up. Julia Alvarez has written a children's story about it. Janetta published a 2016 article, right? Where I quote here, she was able to, she uses these very eloquent sort of binaries of progresso, y regresso, and contradiction within tradition. So it's much more complex than I can really just summarize here. But there's so many scholars with so many, whether it's sociology or literature, Dominican women in a seminar in the article that's mentioned, like a sort of search for the divine feminine, right? Non-Dominicans, I'm a Dominicanista, not a Dominicana, who are trying to look at the myth as a portal to, as Heidi enunciated, a way of reading and way of understanding. So when I was preparing for this talk, in my scattered way, I actually thought about Ruth Ozeki, who is a Smith alum, and she was also on the Creative Writing Advisory Board briefly when I came on. And in her book, she has a 2015 book called The Face, A Time Code, where she undertook this exercise of looking at her face. It was she's a Zen priest. So she looked at her face for 3 hours, and that was a meditation exercise. But it also became a meditation on aging. So Rhina, as a poet, in many of her texts, her first full-length poetry book came out when she was in her 60s, but she was a teen star poet. When she was 16, she was the youngest ever person to be inducted into the American Poetry Society. So if you think about their trajectory, it makes us reevaluate what exactly does it mean to be old, right? Like so many of our, I mean, whether from a capitalistic perspective, it's been mentioned in earlier panels, so many of us have bought into that idea like, oh no, we're getting old, we're expiring, we're not relevant. Like all these sorts of extremely misogynistic paradigms that are pressed upon us so that we buy more anti-wrinkle cream, like that sort of idea, right? Paradigms like the Ciguapa with her backward feet, right, make us question and reset those ideas, right? Because part of the mythology is predicated on the idea that she cannot be tracked, right? While she is cast as a predator, right, she can have homicidal intent toward men. She lures them in, and then she kind of, it's like, it's a fascination and desire, but also danger, right? She's actually not just a predator, though, because if we can reread her as a protagonist, somebody who has sovereignty over her own body. I mentioned in the article, when I was in Santo Domingo for a conference, I had a lawyer, a feminist lawyer, come up to me and tell me, her name was Ildalina Tatembrache, and she said, you know what, when I was growing up, Ciguapas were in the hills, right? And she said, whenever like men would come around, men and boys like talking their talk and maybe even, sexually harassing us, me and my girlfriends could just evoke, you know what, there's Ciguapas in the woods, right? Up there on the mountains. So, watch yourself. And they'd go away, right? So, and that happened again when I was in New York City at a symposium for Rhina at Word Up Bookstore. I had another Dominican woman, an older woman, she come up to me and she said, yeah, you know what? Yeah, there actually are Ciguapas, right? So if you think about it, what we're doing is we're straddling, right? This is the myth, this is the reality. Are you coming, are you going? Are you being tracked and hunted? Or are you making your own way? So I think what we have here is a really powerful commentary on like body sovereignty. Heidi mentioned ecological mindfulness, right? The Ciguapan woman, Janetta uses the term ciguapear as a verb. I use the term, going back to Dr. Saraswati's point earlier today, she mentioned like how we use generative terms, right? To come to terms with what we're trying to convey. I use the word Ciguapismo as a way of coming, how Rhina Espaillat comes to terms with coming and going as a commentary on age, right? As a commentary on respecting and loving our bodies, but also as a meditation on the mindfulness that we need to understand the encroachment of loss, but also an ability to actually reconcile ourselves and have gratitude for loss. So in an eco sort of feminist way, I'm suggesting in this article that we can deploy mythologies. In this case, a Dominican myth. We can deploy corporeal awareness. We can deploy corporeal critique, social critique. I'm going back to Deepa's talk about sexual violence, right? If you can tell men, right, who are going out of their way to harass you, like, watch yourself. I have the Ciguapas looking out for me. It's a commentary on not being safe, right? So that's powerful. And there's also a creative consciousness here because as an elder, Rhina is also consummately a teacher, but she's also a translator. She works with words, and the words are her currency. The words are her power. The words keep her young, right? And keep her engaged with people of all ages, right? So she is called translation, the quote, shared art of writing backwards. So right? You see the power there, right? You're writing backwards because you have to have this constant sort of concatenation between what the original text says and then what you are translating it as, and then, how do these work together? Do they, mesh, right? So I think that's really powerful. Another point I wanted to make vis-a-vis Heidi's great question is, when we're thinking about modes of reading, I think it's in this case, modes of interpreting our bodies, right? The female body, whether it's aligned with social forces, environmental forces. And if we review and reread mythic archetypes, right, and we critique them, we're empowering ourselves because we are able to push back against the idea that we're flawed, we're changing, we're going downhill, all of these sorts of really diminishing, right, sorts of ideas that we've been fed and are constantly fed. I think the backwards feet are really revolutionary because they allow us to envision going forward. So going backwards, right, but going forward. So again, that sort of depolarization is a reset. It offsets and it resets. And I think that's really transformative. Part of my schematizing for this project overall was acknowledging, and maybe this goes back to Ruth Ozeki's The Face, a Time Code, because she does meditate strongly on aging. And as a Zen priest, she is able to think about suffering, right, and impermanence and the non-self. And she asks us, okay, so how much purchase do we put in our bodies, right? How we look to each other, right, or to ourselves, and how much do we move through, right, all the phases of our life with a sense of value, with a sense of self-love, and with a sense of realistic, but as well as spiritual consciousness. So I think there is also a spiritual angle to this. Marianela Medrano Mara, who is the Dominican woman that I mentioned at the beginning, who ran a seminar for Dominican women. Oftentimes, many of these were survivors of sexual and other forms of violence. It was an attempt to see the Ciguapa as a portal to a reappreciation and a recorporalization of the body as not something that's necessarily, rent and torn apart, that needs to perpetually be healed, but something that is intact already and just needs to be reconfigured, if you will. So the divine feminine, the claiming of that spiritual power is part of the Ciguapan legacy. And then ultimately, to sort of conclude, I think reading is about intelligibility, right? And it's about absorption, and it's about consumption, and it's about digestion, sometimes indigestion, right? But what comes up after, right, that reading process is about knowledge and self-knowledge, hermeneutics, right? Peace, reflection, action. Ultimately, I think, at least in my reading of Rhina Espaillat's Poetics, is the Ciguapa is a disruption, but she's also a wake-up call. And she's a refusal to stand still and let things happen to us, right? She's somebody, the Ciguapan woman, or as I place the mythology onto Rhina Espaillat, she's also a form of protection. She's also a form of solidarity. And because there are so many, right, versions of being true to oneself, I think being able to value the self at all stages of life, coming and going, right? Oftentimes when you think about somebody who's neither coming nor going, it seems to be a state of paralysis. No, it's a state, it's a liminal state, and it's a state of pause. And that pause is imbued with a lot of possibilities. So that's hopefully what I conveyed in the article. I don't know, you can read it, but thank you so much for listening.
A pause or maybe a rest.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Nancy. Min, we also had a great bridge with the mention of translation. So your article on the Korean nationalist controversy over the English language translation and awarding of Hong Kong's novel, The Vegetarian, raises a number of fascinating questions about literature in translation. And we've, of course, Meridians and Feminist Africa have been talking about the importance of translation all week. You argue persuasively that the controversy really exposes a discomfort with female subjectivity, which is here embodied both in the active role of a translator and the novel's themes, as well as coming from a lingering sensitivity to cultural purity and linguistic fluency that are holdovers from Japanese imperialist efforts to stamp out Korean identity. And I think there's some great resonances here with Deepti's work as well. How can we better frame and understand the role of translation in, or maybe I should say as, the mode of feminist solidarity that you put forth in the article's conclusion?
First of all, thank you so much, Heidi, for
Switch over. We're down to one, folks.
Oh, first of all, Heidi, thank you so much for the question. As I said earlier, I feel like you're not only just giving a generous reading, but I feel really heard the way you frame my article. So I just wanted to share that appreciation. Thank you so much, Junetta, and all the team at Meridians for having me here. It's truly an honor to be able to speak at this symposium and to celebrate such a special moment. I would like to be a little vulnerable here in the beginning before I answer the question, which is I tend to struggle with the feeling of being at home or the sense of belonging because I had a childhood where I was living in the States for like a year and I went back and then I came back again and I went back. And because of that, when I enter, the Korean educational system, people would say, oh yeah, that girl from America. But when I live in the States, it was, the girl from Korea. And the discourse on Korean Americans didn't really fit my experience. So I ended up feeling alienated no matter what. And I came to sort of enjoy being in that liminal space. But then when I was writing articles and finding what I'm passionate about, and I have this hunch that this is important, my writing, my baby, was also in a pickle where it was, oh, where does this belong? How does this get intellectually or institutionally recognized? And when I, and there's Meridians with all the keywords, for me, that was necessary for me to have that voice, to have that platform. And it's so important. I just wanted to share how I appreciated that as a possibility. So I'm going to start talking about the translation controversy in South Korea regarding Hong Kong's Vegetarian. When you look at the translation controversy, which focuses on the inaccuracies between the original and the translation, as scholars, we know, for example, there is never going to be a one-on-one translation that's going to be perfect. But the inaccuracies, the obsession over those mistakes were very overdetermined. So it wasn't just about Deborah Smith not being fluent enough in Korean and not being able to translate it accurately, but there are these pushes of trying to separate 채식주의자 from the vegetarian, saying it's a totally different work. It's a secondary creation. It's a rewriting. And part of the reason that was happening was because the Man Booker Prize in 2016, and this is also true for the Nobel Prize, that it's a national glory. But when we're looking at, for example, discourses on, oh, then why didn't Korean literature get recognized before this? Is it the role of the translator? Is it because it was translated in a specific way? Then there was this backlash of thinking, well, does that mean it's all on the translator? And the way this discourse unfolds is that the inaccuracies in translation doesn't really get focused on whether Young-hae's experience with this particular violences she gets to experience in the book in South Korean society, is that misrepresented? That was never really the conversation, but more like, look, we have this international audience. Finally, someone's looking at us. We need to preserve this idea of pure original culture and share this excellence, prove this excellence of Korean literature to the world at large. So the discourse really quickly warps into, oh, look at this English woman butchering the text. This is savagery. Giving us the award is an added insult. This is a national disgrace, and so on and so forth. So what happens in the process was very interesting. One is it reinforces this idea of a translator as what Deborah Smith says as a feminized profession. So for example, translation is already muddled with metaphors and words that evokes the figure of a woman. So it's either having fidelity to the original, or it's beautiful, it gets hideous, and so on and so forth. But also there's a certain humility that is being demanded to the translator, saying, don't make your presence be known. We want you to stay quiet in the back burner again, or in the background. There's something really important going on, which is, there's a deference of culture. We need to preserve this culture as this pure thing that's superior in our prioritization of the combating of rights. So what happened in the controversy, which was shocking to me, was that the way that the translation errors were talked about was filled with post-colonial decolonization terms, language of resistance. But what was happening was a silencing of the female voice, and not really thinking about what needs to be communicated, including the critique that the novel was giving. So that in that nationalist kind of framing of this is the issue of national mission, the role of translation was something like there's this pure original culture that needs to be just packaged to a transnational audience. What I wanted to do in rethinking of that role in my article was to go back and be faithful to what the vegetarian was trying to say, because Young-hae's, there are different ways of looking at Young-hae's resistance. It could be a certain kind of passivity, but resistance to violence. But it could also be, and also radical commentary of, in the process of thinking of bodily autonomy and agency, there's a way that yourself is also tangled in it, your desires, your past experiences. The trauma is not just external, it is part of yourself, and the confrontation of that is part of the difficulty that gets included in these resistance. So what I did in the article was to spin this idea of the failure of translation. So on the one hand, Deborah Smith says, I failed okay. And rather than saying there's always going to be this perfect original, that translation is always going to desperately attempt to succeed and yet fail, I wanted to focus how there's a certain kind of failure that gets exposed that is already in the original, that is passing to be normal, natural, universal, and so on. And I think that's that also matches how the vegetarian is also talking about what Younghae ends up doing in her resistance. Everyone around her gets triggered because they have to confront that ideology that they've been living as something default. And they keep pushing back and saying, you know, the vegetarians, or, you know, the likes of, you know, the proper or true vegetarians are the one with the ideology. So there's always that kind of battle or pushback. So going against the success, failure, and success is always desirable, let's think of a certain kind of failure that helps us see something that cannot be seen in isolation. And another way of also rethinking about the role of translation was, well, maybe despite those mistakes, there was a certain kind of success in its translation in relation to female subjectivity and the chapter 2, which has to also do with female sexuality. So maybe the real scandal was not the failure of Deborah Smith translating with a bunch of mistakes, but the actual success that she managed to communicate to a wider audience.
Thank you, Min. All right, we're going to move to our broader questions, which are open to all the panelists, but it's the end of the day, so I'm going to point at people to start. So my first question is, what do the keywords of Meridians, feminism, race, transnationalism, mean to literary studies today? What are the current directions, but also the most pressing needs for literary scholarship to do further work with these three words? Ayesha?
Yeah, so a big question. But I think the keywords of race, feminism, and transnationalism still has a sense of urgency about it. And I think about Paula Giddings' comments last night about a moment where one could not claim to be Black and a woman or negotiate racial politics and gender politics. And I don't feel we're in that moment, but we are in a moment, still in a moment of urgency where race, feminism, and transnationalism remain provocative concepts and methods that continue to inform knowledge production and, to evoke Ruth Simmons from last night, inspire democratic processes or practices. So that's how I'm thinking about the meaning of those words. And now, in regard to literary studies, it speaks to the hallmark of literary studies, which is our attention to language, our fostering or efforts to foster critical thinking, but also how we engage in interpretive practices. So I think about the implications of that for what we do as scholars, but also what that looks like in the public sphere, particularly in our contemporary context and relationship to access to literature in high schools, for example, which literature and books being very important for exposure to culture, but also realizing identities that speak to race and feminism and transnationalism, but also what it means for access to scholarship, where it's not just literature taking out of library shelves, but also scholarship taken out of universities, the libraries of universities and colleges as well. So I think those things gesture, and more than gesture, I'm thinking of a stronger word, to the import of not only literature, but also literary studies scholarship. So in thinking about needs and directions, things that come to mind for me, especially as what I would frame myself as a literary historian, literary history is still important, particularly in a moment where we're questioning what are facts and what is history, and history being erased or denied or removed, et cetera. So literary history still being very important. To our relationship to broad audiences, and specifically thinking about the public humanities. The humanities have been under assault for some time, but I think we're seeing in a real visceral way the consequences of that now. And so I would say that a need or a direction for literary studies is more attention or a returned attention to the public humanities, and the importance of literature and reading, and the lofty idea of the public good. And finally, I would say in our AI context, a direction and or need would be our involvement in the digital humanities. So someone mentioned in an earlier panel, thinking about AI or a contemporary technological moment is, the problematics of that, potential problematics of that is extraction, for example, and also questions about ethics. But if we think about what humanists do or literary scholars do, et cetera, and the ways in which we might utilize the digital humanities is to think about access, but also an ethic of how we read and how we approach and engage in humanistic endeavors. So those are my responses.
We've only got the one. You want to go?
Oh, and me? Okay. I was trying to pass it back to you. Okay. Thank you so much, Eloquent. I actually wanted to focus, maybe this is kind of cheating. Can I focus on meridians instead of the 3 words?
Sure.
Yeah, okay, thanks. So I wanted to return to one denotation of meridians as in view of traditional Chinese medicine, right? TCM. Meridians are points on the body, right? And I think part of Meridians as an institution, as an endeavor, as a site for the meeting of minds, as well as a sort of thinking back to Deepti's presentation about inherent violences, healing, sickness, all of these come to bear on the idea of, like, in traditional Chinese medicine, you have, for instance, when Deepti, sorry, I keep mentioning you, it was an impactful presentation, but when you're talking about violence and like triggering points, if you think about acupuncture, for instance, it hurts when the needle goes in, right? But at the same time, just as we saw at the lunchtime presentation and performance, right, of the Deepti, the idea of through movement, right, you can see joy, right? Through movement, you can, whether voice or stomping, like you can see the expenditure and the movement and the energy, right? And that energy is what prevents stagnation. We cannot be stagnant, right? In an environment such as this one, right? Where there is fear and whereas there's constant latency of harm, right? So I wanted to think about meridians as a form of and an invitation to rebalancing, because part of health and traditional Chinese medicine is balancing the qi, or in Korean, ki, right? So healing is in movement, and we got to move forward and backwards, right? In like Sankofa, right? You got to go backwards to go forwards. Ciguapa, backwards feet going forward, right? So I think there's that. So you can have trigger points, but you can also have endorphins coming out, right? Pain, but also the ultimate like desire for some balancing and health. And I think that's something that we all, as feminists, we want health and we want happiness, right? It seems very simple, but it's extremely complex. So that's what I wanted to say about that. Thank you.
I was thinking about this question in relation to teaching literary studies to students and, teaching. What I want to emphasize when I'm teaching feminism, race, and transnationalism in the classroom is that what we're witnessing are sites of oppression, sites of injustice or inequality. That is not really, and that is not really simply localized in that context, but something that you must engage with rather than saying, I will let this person speak and I will listen and have that kind of a passivity in absorbing the materials. Of course, I recognize the significance of it. But I do, what I witness in the classroom sometimes is almost this falling back of, oh, okay, I have no way of engaging with this, so I will just sit down and listen, and it ends there. And oftentimes, I mean, they are well-meaning and they have tremendous guilt, but that doesn't really lead to anything of a meaningful change. And there are also questions about how some of the ways students can understand racialization, feminism, and so on and so forth, is that in the process of trying to dismantle the power structures, sometimes they fall into a certain kind of essentializing of thinking of these struggles and thinking or not being able to realize that some of the identities that we're talking about could be ideological designations that we should also be aware of, critical of, and not be too accepting about certain ideas of ourselves. So for me, these keywords are about, and I'm going back to Professor Ranjuher's earlier comment about rethinking the universal in this particular context, how historically universality, especially in the 20th century, in the colonization context, was abused and used in the sense where it was only supporting particular identities or particular systems of power, but it used the rhetoric of universal and where they were acting as if they were possessing it when they did not. And I think because of that horror, I think some of my students are saying, oh, this is bad. Like, let's not think about the universal. It's all about diversity and differences. And we end up staying divided as a result. So trying to bring back that element in the conversation and not give the universal to these problematic moments is something that I deeply care about in relation to these keywords.
So I'm obsessed with figuring out if this still works. Is it actually not? Okay. So these are two actually rendered. I wanted to give it like one last try. Thank God this is the last panel. I actually like my thoughts are sort of segueing perfectly from yours, and thank you all for these really interesting reflections on these terms, and to you, Nancy, for also asking us to think about the term meridians. I really sort of loved all of the reflections. So I would also say that the sort of one of the pressing needs in any field, and you're right, this does come up quite often in the classroom, but just I think it's also like largely a kind of liberal current, in women and gender studies as a field, and perhaps in other fields as well, to kind of reduce these terms of feminism, race, transnationalism, to a simple politics of inclusion, right? Like, so an inclusion and diversity, like DEI-oriented approach to implementing feminism, race, transnationalism, which I find most dissatisfying. Is just add women and people of color. I mean, I know this critique has been around in feminist studies for years, but it sort of retains its, its value is add women and people of color and stir, right? So it is that kind of inclusion rather than committing, like reminding ourselves, and as I often have to remind students, because I find especially the word transnationalism often gets sort of used as a substitute for global South. I'm looking for some transnational authors. I'm looking for some transnational theorists. What you mean is, and that's a valuable thing to do. You should be looking for perspectives like outside of your American context. I think that's very important. But I think students often forget, including graduate students, I find myself having to remind them that transnational as an analytic that, that asks us to think about our sort of implications, right? And our connectedness, like not that we're like in our different little silos and that there's, struggles have nothing to do with each other. And the only way is, the only way to avoid a politics of saviorism is to just not engage. Like, I think that's often where the conversation ends. So I would say, sort of recommitting to, opposing colonialism, undoing capitalism, thinking about our implication in the sort of multiple genocides happening right now. These are the feminist projects that I think are on the surface for me. So, I have more to say, but, just to think about how then transnational feminisms can lead us to better solidarities, right? That sort of avoid these pitfalls of like saviorism or appropriation, but still lead us to some kind of connection. By the way, Chandra Mohanty's essay, Under Westernized Revisited, like really talks about this particular problematic. I just taught it a couple of weeks ago in my feminist theories class, and she does talk about this aspect of connectedness falling out, right? That is still something, the point of Under Westernized was never to say that we shouldn't engage each other's, we shouldn't engage transnationally, but how to do it better and without sort of falling into this false idea of like global sisterhood or solidarities that's just based on women as a biological category.
Thank you all. Anniversaries are about celebrating the past, but they're also about looking ahead. So in that spirit, if you could all add one keyword to feminism, race, transnationalism that represents an area of inquiry that you think needs emphasis or is particularly important in conversation with feminism, race, and transnationalism, something that Meridians and all of us might bear in mind for the next quarter century, what would it be? Nancy? They had these pre-circulated, it's fine.
This one too? I don't remember this. Really? Oh, I missed that. Okay, so this is a test. Okay, I think our printer broke in our department, so I only printed out the first set of questions. Oh, no, that's fine. I'll think on the spot. It's be a F- answer, but I think what came to mind as you were speaking is, and it kind of correlates with what I said about like balance and avoiding stagnation and the Meridians idea is mending, because I think there's so much violence, right? That seems to, be endemic to our condition, many of our conditions today in varying capacities and degrees. So I think, what is it that can bring us together? So I don't know if that works because of meridians and mending, maybe that sounds like a craft group, right? But anyway, I'm gonna pass it to Ayesha.
Thought you were gonna go that way. I don't believe in like trying to fix things that aren't broken. So I don't, in responding to this question, I don't feel like there's a need for, for an addition. But again, being so inspired by last night's plenary conversation, my chosen word would be praxis. And I was struck by the not even the juxtaposition, but the interrelatedness between the idea of social workers and social strategists. And I think the idea of praxis might invite more explicit engagement with those different roles potentially, and maybe even challenge, I would identify as maybe as a strategist more than a worker, to challenge strategists to think about what it means to do that work, and workers to think about what it means to be a strategist. So that it would invite those kind of if we're using those terms, but I think the other terms were like activists and academics, right? To explicitly interrogate and problematize and reevaluate and reconsider what those mean and what those might look like.
What I had is translation. And it's not a translation in terms of language to language or making the foreign more entering into the discourse and get it more eligible or understandable. I was thinking more in terms of how it's not just languages, but it could be cultures, political situations, or even about the self, where there is that enigma within or a question within that escapes those predetermined categories or, again, ideological designations. And I think there is a way that we could be translating something in that way. And to me, when I was looking at the keywords for Meridians, and I completely agree. I don't think there's any necessity to add anything, but I think this is how I was engaging with the work in general, which is there a way to carve out a voice maybe that wasn't really obvious to me, but only becomes possible when I start to write. And I feel like the act of translation could also act in those ways as well. It's only when you start writing, you get to see something that was always there, but it wasn't really possible to notice. So that was the word.
I'll keep mine brief, and I think it will sound a bit lazy because it is one of those buzzwords that has become a bit of a buzzword, but I'll throw it on the table. I agree with you, Ayesha, that there's no need to fix what isn't broken. This is perfect. All the words are in there, including meridians. I guess my word was decoloniality, partly because that's what's on my mind, and given the, as a kind of reminder of the ongoing occupations and sort of moments of settler colonization we're seeing, in so many parts of the globe, from Turtle Islands to Palestine to Kashmir and beyond. So I just wanted to put that on the table, but there's really no need to add to these words because I think there's a way to incorporate a sort of decolonial focus within all of this, within feminism, race, and transnationalism.
You want to go to Q&A? Okay. All right, let's open it up to Q&A then, please. Janelle?
There's one mic.
Oh, no.
Apparently, I'll keep working on the other ones.
There you go.
All right.
Well, thank you to all the panelists. This was so engrossing and engaging. And I love the keywords that were suggested: Ayesha's praxis and Deepti's decoloniality, right? There we go. Just decolonial. Oh, okay, yeah. I think either of those or both of those would fit right in, I think, with what Meridians is doing. I do have a specific comment. I don't even know if there's a question added to it, but it's for Nancy, because I was really struck by the description of the Ciguapa. Is it Ciguapa? Yeah. Which sounds a lot like a folklore figure called Madame La Jablesse in Trinidad, she doesn't have backward feet, but her feet are like cloven. They're like a calf's foot. But it's the same thing. She lures men into the forest and you never see them again. And I think quite a number of cultures have very similar. And even the description that you gave also reminded me of the Samara villain in The Ring, which of course is an appropriation of Japanese horror. So what do you think, when we think of the transnational and using a decolonial feminist praxis of looking at all these different literatures, what do you think is a common theme, and how do you see us being able to kind of line up these different kinds of stories that have some similarities, even though there are these like key local differences?
Thank you so much, Janelle. What a wonderful question. Thank you so much. I think that one of the major sort of continuities, and this has come up in the previous panels by multiple colleagues, is the idea of controlling women, right? And it seems so axiomatic, but, and as, you know, in deference to the Korean culture that Min Young evokes, like for instance, Gumiho, right? The nine-tailed fox, right? There's so many, a multiplicity of different global mythologies where women are demonized and they're made monstrous. And it's an attempt in many ways, right? Even with, you know, the idea that you enunciated about how do we control these women as if they were like animals, right? Like how can we create this discourse of civil, as Heidi mentioned, like civilizing or taming, right? So many of these, and we can see this in transatlantic slavery, right? With the excision of, excuse me, for content warning violence, but the excision of the tongue, for instance, Anna Maureen Laura, who's a Dominican-American writer. I believe she teaches at the University of Oregon. She has a book called Conjure Woman, and it's spoken from the perspective of a woman originally from Africa, but she had her tongue excised in the Caribbean. So she's speaking through the excised tongue, right? Yeah, no, absolutely. And you can see it's like a speaking through, like a coming through slaughter, right? Through the violence, you still have voice, right? Through all of these sorts of attempts to control, right? You still have the resilience, and resilience was maybe another term that has come up multiply across our panels. So yeah, no, that's an absolutely powerful question, because when we think about the various trigger points, right, in history, right? Whether in the Harriet Tubman example that you evoked, right? And the ongoing struggle to acknowledge, right, the various women who've been really subjugated through these, you know, perversions of, and even storytelling, right, is not just a medium, right? But it's a sort of form for the examination of values. And those values are very temporally inflected. So I think that I really appreciate your bringing us to consciousness of how much we've just simply accepted as such, right? Yeah, thank you again.
You don't have. Okay. All right. Yeah. Just Jessica.
Thank you to all of you and to everyone, actually. As I keep saying, I'm a practitioner, for want of a better word, as in the majority of my work is not at all located in the academy, but it's engaged with, I feel like the underlying questions everybody is trying to deal with are similar. And it strikes me that everybody kept talking about how, you know, Meridians as a journal welcomed them, were the first to see them. You know, there's a deep kinship. But also, I agree with the analysis of meridians in the body and the mending. And so I was wondering, actually, in terms of that idea about what next, meridians are so engaged in the questions of the world. And it's like we're very interested in each other. We actually really want to know. We're interested in all these histories and phenomena and creation that have kind of been excised from majority documentation and analysis, right? And what would it look like? It's a bit similar to the question I asked yesterday, which was maybe slightly misread, because my question is like, how do we re-engage that, including with practitioners? Like, Meridians is a physical journal, but what else? And would there be a way to keep expanding this community and find like live ways to engage? So I wonder if even for you in your own work, what would you imagine as a super exciting way to kind of re-engage the world after your observations of the world that you've written? You know, what would be a super exciting way of engaging that? Because it just strikes me that we're all trying to do similar things in terms of shifting up power, you know? And there's so much practice in the world, and there's so many spaces where, you know, this is of interest. And I'm wondering what you would see as ways to continue to make your work alive. So not just as journal articles. How else could you imagine engaging this in the world? And in part also, how can people like myself and others who work in the space of transnational feminist praxis be of assistance in that?
One on this side would like to start.
Thank you for that. Is it actually working? What a wonderful question. How can we sort of re-engage in the world, and how can we carry these ideas forward? I think like this kind of takes me to how much of my work in the last decade or more has been based in collaborative feminist communities, without which I just don't think anything I published after tenure was basically done in that spirit. I just didn't want to do just kind of, soldier away on my own anymore, especially once I had that kind of security, I was able to sort of pursue it a lot more. And I think that is the thing that sort of keeps me most engaged in the work, keeps me in community. It's something I would really, endorse to everybody. It keeps the work alive. I will say that, it is sort of under the conditions of surveillance that we see in so many parts of the world. I mean, in the United States, but definitely if, many of us were doing research on Kashmir, the Indian state sort of surveils us pretty hard. It does have a really chilling effect, and it really does have a great impact on our ability to sort of engage outside of our sort of, intimate spaces of collaboration that we've come to trust. And so, that is something that's a kind of open question for me. How do we break out of the kind of paralysis that has been foisted on us by an environment of almost total surveillance? Like, a lot of us feel like the kinds of things that we've been trying so hard to do, which is take our work outside of the ivory tower, take it, like organize things online. Like, the Zoom sort of revolution was a mixed blessing. Like, on the one hand, it allowed us to sort of suddenly, realize that we could do these, have these conversations about our research that reached large numbers of audiences globally. And on the other hand, also realizing that just opened us up to that much more surveillance, and that, to the point where many of us are now actively sort of afraid to be in those kinds of spaces. And it has played a huge role in the ability of our research to travel. And actually, I don't even want to talk about my research. What I've seen in terms of scholarship, speaking of the Global South, the kind of collective work that I have been doing with many of my colleagues in the Critical Kashmir Studies Collective, which is a large network of Kashmir scholars. Over the last 5 years or so, we've witnessed a massive shift from scholars based in Kashmir being able to sort of actively participate and contribute to our editorial projects to just withdrawing and shutting down. We can no longer, like the surveillance of the Indian state is so absolute. And we're seeing something like it here now, right? We can no longer, none of them will touch with a barge pole anything that has the word decolonial attached to it. So I don't even know if, I put that on the table, but honestly, I think we're in this moment of having to maybe find new vocabularies where we can actually continue to have these conversations, outside of these sort of radioactive spaces, and maybe even these terms, right? There are terms that we can use in the diaspora, even something like occupation or settler colonialism, that scholars who are based in those regions who are suffering those conditions cannot use those words. And so I just want to put on the table that that's what a lot of us are facing right now. And by the way, speaking of literature, this one last thing I will say is that, as much as literature is a sort of emancipatory generative space, for a lot of states, like, again, the part of the world I come from, there is this glut of state-sponsored literary festivals, by the way, now, where literature is, as ever, a tool of empire, a tool of state building, a tool of, a very perverse kind of nation building. And so, I think, like, for me, as a women and gender studies scholar, I'm always interested in what's happening in the text, and also like the larger context in which literature is kind of mobilized and, instrumentalized in the service of colonialism too. So colonial potboilers are well and alive as well. We can talk about genres if there's time. Yeah.
Oh, oh, thank you so much for the question. For me, oh, sorry. No, no. Um, so for me, a lot of the problems that I identify in my work is what seems to be reasonable and radical resistance is actually reinforcing status quo, and it oftentimes has to do with what becomes unimaginable in certain cases. And for the scholarly work to have that impact in the real world is to make that realm opened up. So the rigidity of what seems to be commonsensical, what seems to be a good thing to pursue, needs to be shaken up to ensure there is not another layer of oppression that gets reinforced in the process. So I have two things in mind when I say this. One is in the Second World War II and the colonization project, it was human rights and women's status that was evoked under the name of the universal that justified invasions. We see the treatment of women that is quote unquote savagery. You don't care about women's education. There needs to be enlightenment. There is a kind of a moral authority that gets evoked in those situations that actually triggers a lot of resistance to respond to it, either as doubling down and say, well, this is what needs to be respected, the treatment of problematic treatment of human lives, or say, oh yeah, that's right, let's educate some of our women so they can be better in our larger movement that is more important than gender issues. So, so there is that kind of a tricky thing where if we just accept that as, oh, there is a moral authority, there is a universal that gets violated, the response could be actually reinforcing an already problematic status quo. I'm also thinking about the issues of comfort women, that how it's talked within South Korea, where it's nationalized. So as it was happening at in the 30s and 40s, and in these comfort stations, the discussion didn't happen until the 90s, actually, among men, with politicians making it a national issue. So it wasn't individual rights or about gender and the sexual violence, but more about, okay, here's a national issue that needs to be resolved. And on the one hand, that is a legitimate way of thinking about this problem, but on the other hand, that also actively makes things unimaginable, which is, for example, the Japanese feminists who are against and who are working really hard with our historical archives to actually trace how these histories happen. Having solidarity with Japanese activism is unthinkable if we just accept this as a national issue and Japan needs to apologize and so on and so forth. Same thing with comfort women in different nationalities. If it gets explicitly, this is just about Korean women, that is also a problem of silencing and, framing a discourse in a particular way that seems like it's about valid human rights concerns, but ends up being problematic. So trying to open that up is something that I think is important in this scholarship. Yes.
Okay, so I want to think back. Thank you for the excellent question. I really appreciated your question about praxis too yesterday. I think as my colleagues were speaking, I thought back. I believe the date was 2019. Janetta, do you remember you came to University of British Columbia to do a Meridians panel on publishing? Yes. So Janetta came to the Congress of the Social Sciences and Humanities in Canada and gave a presentation on Meridians. And one of the really important questions that she answered was, an audience member had said, why do women of color make it so hard for other women of color to succeed? And Janetta had said, that's because they were treated badly themselves. And there's this sort of unresolved, sort of trauma, right? Like, I didn't get it easy, so why should you, right? And I thought back to an earlier panel, I think it was, Chandra, it was your panel where you used the word capacious, right? to describe Jeanette, actually. The idea of capaciousness, I think, is in the same semiotic as generosity, right? And I'm thinking back to another, this was praise that was given to another Dominican-American writer, Junot Diaz, where there's a difference between writers who open doors for other people and there's other writers who close doors for people, right? And just as was said yesterday, right, with President Simmons, when she said, you know, and Ayesha mentioned this, you can be elite, but you without being elitist, right? I think part of the important praxis, as my colleague, the originary colleague mentioned, it's important for us to invite people in instead of keeping them out, right? And I'm thinking to one of my colleagues, I think she teaches at University of Massachusetts Amherst now. She's a Chicana feminist, Stephanie Feta. She said, don't write off people. And I remember this was at a 2016 sort of activist faculty Mellon sort of seminar. And it was a very politically rife and often, for me at least, I felt it was a traumatic experience. But in retrospect, it always came back to me as a sort of like clear and like clarion-like comment that she had made. And she said, don't write off people because you can't assume where they're coming from, right? And I think that's really important for us. So just as was enunciated yesterday, like, remember, right? You need allies. We need allies, right? Don't write off people because they are not like you, right? And I think that's very powerful. Thanks.
I think what I would add to what's been said, and specifically thinking about re-engaging the world, and from my kind of standpoint as a literary scholar, I would agree with Deepti about collaboration. I think that's one of the ways in which I have envisioned how that might happen in collaborative projects, but also in working with different kinds of partners as one way of re-engaging the world. I think the other way, which comes from kind of literary pedagogy, is dialogue. And so fostering those in various kinds of venues. And so I've thought about this as I was trying to think about how to respond to your question. I've thought about this and done this to an extent with institutions that are all being defunded, essentially. So thinking about state universities, right? The kind of initiatives that have been in operation there, but I'm also thinking about state humanities councils, for example. And going back to one of the things I said earlier about public humanities, right? Like that is one way in which the collaborative happens, but also drawing on you know, the academic's expertise or interests or whatnot, but to engage the publics. And so one example or one experience that I've had in regard to that, where a state humanities council's, you know, sponsored faculty to travel the state. You know, we don't always know. I mean, depending upon how long you stay at an institution, you may not always know actually where you live, right? Or be engaging what is supposed to be like a mission of us, you know, of public institutions, right? And so I think that's one way, kind of getting back to that, right? And kind of what I was gesturing towards in terms of public humanities, like talking to people about books, like you know, which libraries have done really well, right? Talking to people about books, highlighting books, also engaging and thinking about what people are reading, right? And so the other aspect as a literary scholar is thinking about the reader. The writer is one thing, but also thinking about the reader and audience, and not just, I guess, not thinking about, like, not just projecting onto them, but also being in dialogue and kind of parsing out or grappling with, like, why are various people reading various kinds of things, and what does that tell us, and then how does that inform how we think about literature and various kinds of practices. So That's what I'm thinking now in response to your question.
One more? Yeah. Oh, well,
Might answer the question. I was curious about your answer to the question.
Right, and then we'll have time for actually one more question. So, you're on the spot.
Yeah, I was just thinking about how there's a lot of existing spaces for convening where practitioners come together who are transnational feminists. And so it could be interesting even to just integrate into those spaces and offer the same content. You know what I mean? Like, speak about your expertise and share your expertise, but just in another space where then it's a conversation that broadens and people also hear about your work. I've, heard about so many interesting vantage points on things, some things I had no idea about, some things I saw in a new way. And like I said, I feel like the underlying current of the political intention is shared, even if people are in vastly different, disciplines and there's a shared political intention, So, and I feel like that intention is shared with other people too. So that was always just exciting. The nonprofit space needs re-energizing in thought as well, rigor and rethinking and new language and, stuff gets really dead, actually, particularly because of funding and the way that funding works. So I don't know, I found it energizing and that's partly why I was asking, And then I also feel like there, in other moments in history and in some movements, the academic practitioner relationship has been very, very close. And I feel like at the moment it's quite distant in many communities. And I wonder if that is generative or not. It feels like it could be brought closer together and without necessarily so much risk. I understand all of that. The practitioners are also dealing with the same. But yeah, it just feels like there's so many spaces where people already are. It would be easy, to do. Even things like, as you're saying, like public humanities integrating into the many literature festivals that are coming up now, just the spaces where people are so people can hear and know more about your work and be in dialogue with it.
One more. Oh, yeah, one more time.
Hey, I have a question, but I just wanted to say a comment because I was dying when you asked the question. I was thinking to myself, I'm a Black female, historian. I'm a Black woman, and I tell students all the time, like Black professors, we don't come from Black professor planet. We're like coming from your communities, Pakistani, professors. I mean, and I understand your question because I think it's very applicable to this Western construct of academia. But I feel like each of us is a resistor to that construct. And I get it, but I think for me, I'm like, when you say that question, I'm like, I am praxis. I'm walking through my community and I reflect. I do cultural history, but I do cultural history because I was listening to Shaka Khan on Saturday morning and my mom, while I was, cleaning that big ass record player in the 70s. So I'm just saying, like, when you ask me that, I can't understand it because I'm like, for me, I embody that and I bring that stuff in the academy because I'm already practicing it as far as I'm concerned. And I could be wrong, who knows, in my community. So I just think, for us in this room, it's important for us to remind ourselves that we are the praxis. Like we broke into this motherfucker. You know what I mean? We broke into this. They didn't be like, come on in. Like we broke in and they passed the alarm. But I just want to remind all of us, and I think this sister was like, just like, we are the people have come over oceans. Like some of us came in slave ships, some of us flew. I mean, Puerto Rico was raided. I'm just saying, like, we're not supposed to be here, but I just want you to know, I mean, at least for me, like, I don't just come to class to like teach, no offense, like little white kids. Like, I'm here for the Black girls. I'm here for the brown girls. I'm here for the, Asian girls. You know what I'm saying? And they come to me. And I also am for those girls out in Holyoke in the street. So I just want to make sure. And if we're not doing that, then I want you to come back and be like, are you doing that? But I just want to make sure that I think for us, we're like, wait, shoot, I'm practicing all day. I'm exhausted from like the clubs but I hear you. I just wanted to make sure I hear you. But I'm sorry, the question I have for you all, and you don't have to answer it because I just took up too much time. But my question was, because you guys are the last panel, and I just loved, I don't know where she went, the sister's description of the points of light between us. And I just was, oh, there you are, Lucy, yes. I'm wondering, since you guys are the last, I'm putting like pressure on you, like what are those points of light? And it kind of like back to her question too, that we are sharing, especially in this conference and at the end, like what do you guys see as the last panel, just like looking back, over it?
No one's making eye contact with me.
Heidi, did you want to answer it? Heidi, as our organizer, can you answer?
All right, go Heidi.
Yeah, Heidi.
Yeah. Yeah.
We'll answer it over dinner, but Heidi, I
Yeah,
do want to
that's a
hear your
great
answer.
idea. Well, I think that what's really come out over the past 3 days is how global those points of light need to be, right? That, charity begins with the person right next to you, right? But solidarity is global. So that is something I think for all of us to double down on, something that's especially important in this time of rising authoritarianism where there's so many fires to pay attention to at home, right? And it can make it difficult to remember that the struggle is everywhere. Last night at dinner, when I was talking to Cookie about how great it is to get to work with Meridians and read so much global work, she just said, yeah, to remind us that we're not alone. And that really is, I think, at the heart of it. But I think that, the points of light, I mean, Lucy, when you were leading that exercise, just in my mind, I was seeing so many points, right? If you had talked any longer, it just would have been a blaze in my mind. And it was such a helpful reflection, kind of in the spirit of what you just said, right? That like the praxis is our life. There's so many points of connection, right? Just community work and my kids' school and art and, my students and professional associations and, my friend who's running for town council. It's just all of these, all of it is together. And as someone who has maybe compartmentalized a little too much all my life, I appreciate this reminder very much.
Thank you again. I'm going to ask you to stay while I make some just closing remarks. So for the photo, I had to jot down, make sure you say these things so I don't forget. First, I wanted to tell you, Heidi, I was actually an English major, and the very first thing I ever published in my life was a poem in the Bilingual Review Press that my professor, who you all met last night, Nancy Supporter Sternbach, sent off to them. I had submitted it to her as a class assignment, and she sent them my poems, and they published 3 of them. And I was like 19 years old because at heart, I wanted to be a writer. But I, at that age, couldn't find the language to talk about the injustice that I wanted to write about that was convincing to people, right? To make an argument to say, this is wrong. I don't know why it's happening, but I know it's wrong and it needs to stop, right? So then I went to econ, and there were no humans in econ. Apparently, only markets, right? And it was actually one of my close friends at Smith, who was a sociology major, who said, you really sound like a sociologist, you should go off. And I did, and it did, give me so many things, but I still use literature in my classes. I use one-act plays, I use poetry, because I do, I just have a profound love for literature in all its forms. So, thank you for the reminder. I also want to thank Nancy, my sister Dominicanist, for reminding us all that Meridians, in the back of every issue, the definitions of meridians are there because the original editorial collective, I wasn't there when they were having these conversations because they were doing this in the 1997, 98, 99. But they chose this name and then they let us know why, right? Because it has all these meetings. So you reminded me, Nancy, that maybe it's useful to read these to you in case you haven't seen it or remembered that you saw it. So meridians, great circles of Earth passing through the geographical poles at any given point on the Earth's surface. Any of the lines of longitude running north and south on a globe or map, representing such a circle or half circle. The highest apparent point reached by a heavenly body in its course, zenith, apex, culmination. Places or situations with their own distinctive character. And finally, in Chinese medicine, the major channels carrying the life force through the body. So what I read to you was from the back of the 20th anniversary reader. And as I was listening to this panel, I thought, how am I going to follow that and end on a note that both does justice to everything that's been given us today and captures a part of the program title that maybe we haven't talked about quite enough, which is momentum, right? The how do we go forward, right? Because it's milestones, which is what these panels have been intended to signal for you, right? These points where these things have been created and published and accomplished and thought and taught and so forth. But also that what they're meant to do is to propel us, right? To propel us and keep us going in our praxis. And then I remembered the thing that I wrote to close out the introduction to this 20th anniversary reader. And if you allow me, I want to read that as the kind of closing statement for the symposium, even though it's from the 20th. I feel like it really still works. Meridians authors are largely, though not exclusively, women of color. Black diasporic, South Asian, Middle Eastern and North African, Asian and Asian American, Latina, Latin American, Caribbean, Native American, Indian, Indigenous, Aboriginal, multiracial. They are typically feminist interdisciplinarians whose work has helped to transform the traditional borders and boundaries of disciplines in the humanities and social science, to decolonize ethnic and area studies, to globalize and transnationalize women, gender, sexuality, feminist studies, and to center race as a critical intellectual project and political concern. Thus, I close by dedicating this reader and this symposium to recently deceased Maria Lugones, 1944 to 2020, whose life work was to both theorize and materialize resistance against modernity's oppressions. Lugones' animating questions resonate with the spirit of this symposium. Quote, how do we learn about each other? How do we do it without harming each other, but with the courage to take up a weaving of the everyday that might just reveal deep betrayals? How do we cross without taking over? With whom do we do this work? How do we practice with each other, engaging in dialogue at the colonial difference? How do we know we are doing it? As our cover art by Samantha Telo, Silence Voices of Everyday Sheroes, illustrates beautifully, Meridians believes that the answers lie in seeking and speaking our peace, P-E-A-C-E, together. A luta continua. Thank you. Please don't do that. That's a bit, but thank you, but don't do that. So this reader, like all the other stuff, is available on the Meridians bookshop. Thank you again. I was reminded by my event organizers to say that dinner is for the registered participants, which is almost everybody here except our beloved Smithies who have a dining hall to go to. So, okay. Those of us who are registered and in the conference, please go ahead and proceed to the campus center. We're going to have a nice meal together and wrap up in